I'd like to now introduce Dan Murphy, anchor and correspondent at CNBC for the next panel on emerging markets.
Are we in the right order?
Yes.
Ladies and gentlemen, warm welcome. Thank you for being in the room with us today. I'm Dan Murphy from CNBC, and I'd like to welcome our next panel to the stage. Please do make them feel welcome. Joining me is Majid, Jafar, Chief Executive Officer of Crescent Petroleum, right at the end there. The Honourable Geoffrey Pyatt is here. He's Assistant Secretary, Energy Resources at the US Department of State. Sir, Assistant Secretary, thanks for being here. Daniel Zelikow is Vice Chair, Public Sector, JP Morgan, and Chair of the Governing Board of JP Morgan's Development Finance Institution. Thank you for being here. And Aubrey Hruby is Non-Resident Senior Fellow, the Africa Centre at the Atlantic Council. So we're going to talk a little bit about the emerging markets here, and I think most importantly, I wanted to thank the Atlantic Council for putting this panel together and of course being at the centre of the global energy conversation. So my first question, perhaps to kick it off with you, Assistant Secretary, is when you think about this challenge in the emerging markets, what is the biggest barrier or the biggest hurdle to deploying energy, capital, and technology in these markets, and why?
Yeah. Well, thanks, Dan. And first of all, let me say how great it is to be back with the Atlantic Council. And I think on the question you pose, I would start with the core principle of the Biden administration, which is that this is the quintessential global issue. We cannot solve the climate challenge without building the broadest possible coalition. The United States is about 11% of global CO2, so we could decarbonize the US economy tomorrow, and we would not solve the climate crisis. So we have to do two things. One, we need to build a broad partnership with our transatlantic allies within the G7, among the developed countries, to mobilize capital, to accelerate the deployment of new technologies, and to decarbonize our energy systems as fast as possible. But we also have to bring along the developing world. And I'm very excited in the role that I've had for a little more than a year now to see how much our Inflation Reduction Act at home has changed the narrative around the United States, has demonstrated the US commitment to literally putting our money where our mouth is on these issues. But I also think we still have a lot of work to do in terms of mobilizing capital, unlocking markets, and then especially recognizing that as we deal with the developing world especially, the pathway that the developing countries take is going to look very different from what we've experienced in the United States. And we certainly need it to look different because we don't have 100 years of fossil energy dependence to lean back on. But we have to figure out how in countries like India, Indonesia, Nigeria, we work as partners in those places to deliver the increased volumes of energy that those countries are going to need to meet the legitimate aspirations of their citizens. The other point I would make in this context, and in the context of the Biden administration's very strong commitment to approaching these issues in partnership, working with our allies, working with the G7, but also working in fora like the G20 and beyond, is that as we listen to the lessons that are coming out of the Inflation Reduction Act, as we move into areas of new technology, new battery storage, clean hydrogen, carbon sequestration, figuring out how we can scale those technologies in a way that becomes deployable. And for me, having spent a lot of my professional career in India and Pakistan, I sort of think of it through a South Asian lens, and understanding that, and I was back in both Delhi and Islamabad over the course of the spring, a few months apart. You know, when you visit that part of the world today, the climate crisis is right in front of everybody's face. There is a recognition of the urgency of energy transition. You see that, for instance, in Prime Minister Modi's very ambitious goals for clean energy deployment. But there's also a recognition or an insistence that transition has to come after access. And so the challenge is to overcome the tension between those two. And that's where I look to Dan and others who are in the market, because that's what's going to solve it.
Okay, Aubrey, did you want to come in here with your thoughts on this as well, particularly from the Africa context?
Sure, thank you. And I really feel so much I was about to say was already said by Assistant Secretary Pyatt, because what he captured is that emerging markets, particularly those in Africa, they have a dual imperative. They have to grow green, but they have to address poverty. And there's no way to address poverty if you can't address energy poverty, right? So if you have 60% or 600 million Africans lack access, reliable access to electricity, which is 80% of the world's population that lacks access, okay? So we know Africa is about 20% of global population, and yet it attracts less than 3% of energy investment globally. So these numbers mean that there's disparity, and this disparity is at the heart of the question of climate justice. Okay, because you have a region that has polluted the least, they have the lowest per capita emissions in the world, and they suffer from the consequences of carbon-intensive growth that enriched all of us. And I pause there because that injustice is real. And so policymakers who are here, and US policymakers, developed world policymakers, have to come at it from a point where Assistant Secretary started, of empathy, of understanding that reality and that dual imperative, right? And that, therefore, we need kind of nuanced thinking when it comes to how we target commitments and financing to African markets, because if we just blanket say no more fossil fuels, for example, then how will countries address their gap in access to electricity if they can't utilize natural gas for base load power? So these issues need nuance. And, you know, I fear the day as an American who lives in Washington, I'm going to log into my 401k and it's going to say to me, do you want any of your retirement invested in fossil fuels? And I'll say no, and that has real impact to what can be invested in markets I care about and invest in other ways. So to me, it takes nuanced thinking, and I hope the negotiators all in the blue zone, et cetera, those in the room, are bringing that to the table. Otherwise, we won't be able to address these major disparities without deep hypocrisy. And so, you know, that reflection is something we need to walk in the door with.
All right, fascinating. Assistant Secretary, I might just get you to respond to that first, if that's okay, particularly on this question of empathy. Can empathy help us solve the climate challenge?
I'm not sure the empathy is the right word. We've got to show up, and we have to be there. And I remember in June, I had the opportunity to be in Abuja. I met with President Tinubu right after his inauguration. And he had two messages for me. One, he said, you know, and I was there, among other things, to roll out a new energy security dialogue that my team is putting together with Nigeria. And he really had two messages to me. One was, terrific you're here. We really want to work with you on so many of these issues, on carbon management, on distributed solar, on grid stability. But his second message was, but remember, we have an alternative. And I think from a strategic perspective, for those of us who live in the Washington bubble, understanding the competition with China and the idea that we are involved in a global competition with a Chinese adversary who has a very different view of how the world needs to be organized, which has been moving faster than we had been until very recently in order to dominate markets in some of these critical energy transition technologies, critical minerals, solar obviously, wind increasingly, hydrogen electrolyzers. So we really have to work even harder. But I think empathy helps, but the first imperative is to be present. And again, I think the Biden administration has internalized that. You saw that the last big Washington visit that we had before the start of COP was from the president of Angola, a country with whom we have a very deep energy partnership. But it is a reminder that we have to keep working on this if we are going to preserve a broad coalition in support of the international order that has so benefited the United States and our allies over the decades.
sorry to labour the point here, but I do want to come back to you on this, Assistant Secretary. We have the time. I'll get to you in just a moment, Daniel. Apologies to do this to you. You mentioned this issue of a dependence on China, and I want you to elaborate on this because one of the most critical issues in global energy through the course of this year and last year has been Europe's dependence on Russian gas. So what can the United States do to ensure that we don't have this equal dependence on Chinese critical minerals and technology?
So Dan, you put it exactly right, and there's a very strong agreement when I'm talking with my counterpart in the Commission, Dita Jorgensen, and I've heard the same from Commissioner Simpson and High Representative Borrell. We cannot be in a position where we exchange an era of European dependence on Russian fossil fuels for an era of collective dependence on Chinese clean technology. That does not mean decoupling from China, but it does mean reducing our exposure. And I had this conversation yesterday with Fatih Birol. The IEA in the last World Energy Outlook, there's a terrific one-page graphic that looks at clean energy supply chains in 2030. And when you look at the data, and it's presented in pie charts, but what you see is a whole lot of orange. And that is the Chinese market share for wind turbines, for solar cells, for batteries, for most of the critical minerals, with the exception of cobalt and lithium. And the processing of almost everything. So I think and this is what the State Department, the administration are working to reverse through initiatives like PGI, the Partnership for Global Infrastructure and Investment, like the Mineral Security Partnership. It's aimed at bringing together a broad international coalition. So in the case of MSP, now 14 countries and economies accounting collectively for more than half of global GDP. Aimed at setting high ESGs consistent with our values and our democracies, but also doing so in a way that delivers value for the producer countries. So I think it's this idea, my boss, Secretary Blinken, talks all the time about coming to the table with a better offer. And I think that's what we need to do. And frankly, that's an opportunity for developing countries in regions like Africa, because we are looking for a dialogue on these issues. And I will say, when I sit down with producer countries, and I remember vividly a conversation with an African minister a few months ago who said to me very explicitly, she said, I just want to say how glad we are that somebody other than China is talking to us about these issues. So we've gotten past that threshold. And again, I hate to keep turning back to Dan on this, but now we've got to get markets to perform in terms of delivering the finance and delivering the deals that will help to truly diversify these supply chains.
Absolutely. So take it away, Dan. JP Morgan, one of the biggest and most important financial institutions in the world. How do you close that funding and investment gap? And what is the role of bankers in this conversation?
Sure. Thanks very much. Before I answer that question, let me first align myself with the comment about that there has to be a recognition that most of the countries in the emerging markets have not been the source of the problem, and that it's quite possible to grow in a green way, and that should be our focus. Moreover, I think it's also essential to recognize that many countries are really not moving the needle in terms of carbon production, that for them the real issue is adaptation. We should maintain focus on that for them, okay? But having said that, how do we get markets to work? I would submit that markets do work, and that the problem we have is not a project financing problem. It's a project development gap. Our experience is that if countries are able to get a few of the basic things right, and that means having projects that make engineering and economic sense, that are sensitive to ESG risks, which by the way don't go away just because it's a renewables project. Having a pricing structure for PPAs that provides an adequate return for debt investors as well as for the project sponsors, whoever that may be, whether it's public or private. Having a network of credit-worthy local institutions, local utilities that have transparent accounts that are, and I should emphasize here, including access to appropriate transmission and distribution. And most of all, allowing those utilities to charge a market price for power. very often power is not allowed to be charged at a commercial price. Now, I'm not saying that it's not appropriate for governments to subsidize users when it's required, especially in very poor areas. But I think it's critical that those subsidies, plus what commercial users are paying, clear the market. Now, how do you overcome this project development gap? It seems to me that there's been a little bit too much emphasis on subsidy and not enough emphasis on getting the economics right, and particularly with respect to the official institutions. In our experience, the official institutions like the World Bank, the IFC, as well as the regional development bank counterparts are absolutely excellent and superbly positioned to provide the necessary inputs to work with governments. Because they're owned by governments, they're in a unique position to be trusted advisors on getting these aspects right. So we would suggest that there be an even greater emphasis on the part of governmental institutions to work with governments and the relevant parties in the developing world to put together these projects. Once they make economic sense, according to those 4 criteria that I mentioned at the outset, money will flow to them. We have no problem getting investors to invest in an asset that kind of has a reasonable assurance of repayment, as well as provides an economic return.
May I jump in quickly there? Because I agree on a few things that were said, but I have a slightly different view on others. One, I mean, from an African perspective, there's a financing gap into energy alone of $225 billion by 2030 to even make a dent. And in fact, even renewable energy investment in Africa is not only stagnant right now, it's falling. Despite abundant resources, geothermal in Kenya, hydro in DRC. I mean, we have a lot of examples. There is a gap in putting together projects. And because it takes pioneers. Fred and I are both from the American West. My family's a long time there, pioneers, okay? The issue I have is if we want regulatory environments to be perfect before we invest in them, our own country would have never invested in infrastructure. We wouldn't have done that. We had pioneering capital and pioneering capitalists that went to places. I mean, in Colorado, people were shooting each other in the streets as justice, and the mail was delivered by a company called Western Union, not government. And then if we talk about subsidies, let's talk about the IRA. So, where we talk about things, we need to think about it from where we came from and what it looks like to the rest of the world. So I do believe there is a gap in putting together projects. I do believe that DFIs, particularly local DFIs, the African Finance Corporation has a project development facility. Africa 50 has a project development facility. But we still have to find partners who are willing to do greenfield long-term projects, which is hard in a capital market space with funds that have got a 7-year lifespan and with other opportunities. Even sitting at home and investing in the S&P 500 will deliver you higher returns. So the opportunity costs that people face today make it difficult for new projects to take place in African markets. So let me stop.
So I don't disagree that there's a financing gap, but the question is that gap a function of projects, or is it a function of capital out there in the world, or ignorant capital?
I think it's a function of a lack of project development, as you've said, but also very high risk perception, and probably not enough energy put to addressing very real risks that exist in a continent where there are 54 countries, and there are, you have all of this division across geopolitical lines, meaning like you need political risk organized differently if you're going to do a regional project. You need currency risk mitigation that doesn't exist. It's hard to hedge. You can't hedge the Naira. So these issues make it, cheaply hedge the Naira. So these issues have to be addressed to do it, because only 3% of the world live in small landlocked countries. 30% of Africans do. That automatically means project costs are going to be high, et cetera. So we have to figure out new risk mitigating devices to make these happen. Because when the projects do happen, they have a default rate 1/3 of that of the United States. A Moody's study, if you look at energy projects default rates in North America, it's 9%. In Africa, it's 3%. Because when those projects get done, they have tons of risk mitigation. They don't default at the same rate.
Okay, let's pause there just for a moment. I want to bring Majid into the conversation as well to give us a private sector capital allocator's perspective on all of this, and someone who's actually operating in the O&G space. Majid.
So I think it's been absolutely great panel, and credit to Fred and Nandan and the Atlantic Council for putting this meeting together that really gets into the core topics around energy and beyond just kind of high-level messages. And it's a great annual event in January every year here in the UAE in Abu Dhabi. So please come back. So I agree with everything that's been said. I don't actually think there's a conflict. I do think that, first of all, I agree very much with the hypocrisy point, as you put it, Aubrey, and I'll come back to that. I do think there does need to be education as well as support on de-risking that you mentioned. And I see it even in countries here in the Middle East. For example, here in the UAE, as we know, we've achieved the lowest cost solar energy in the world, just over a cent per kilowatt hour. There are other countries that we know in the region who have, feel, well, our cost per barrel of oil production is the same. We've got as strong a sun as they do. We should have a cent per kilowatt hour. Well, you don't have an Abu Dhabi credit rating, and you've got a bunch of other stuff going on. So actually, it's not that straightforward. So just getting over those basic structures and regulatory requirements and policy, I think that can and should be a lot more support from Western institutions that can help countries in the global South be ready for that capital that is otherwise available and should be. On the point of the hypocrisy you mentioned, or the need for the empathy, I think it was exacerbated even more last year when we had really a global energy crisis, certainly in Europe, because countries in Africa and elsewhere in the global South saw Europeans turn on coal factories, subsidizing energy at the point of consumption. I mean, massively. I mean, in London, my electricity bill was half paid by the government. They call it energy support, but, subsidy. And then scrambling around to places like Africa, Mozambique, Tanzania, trying to buy the LNG, the gas that they'd refused to finance for domestic use, as long as it's going to Germany and Italy, right? And so that really is like beyond a shock, I think, to these host governments in these countries. And they've been waiting. I mean, we have the Loss and Damage Fund finally announced after many years. But since 2009, there's been this pledge of $100 billion a year. OECD claims it may have been met last year. The jury's out. But they see Inflation Reduction Act, which is amazing, but it's all money at home in the US, $1 trillion maybe. Europe responds with its own version, some sort of a trade war in the name of climate going on, again at the expense of the global South. That's the perception. And then there's been this ideological opposition or animosity in Western financial institutions, major multilateral development banks and others, not only against oil, gas, nuclear, hydro. I mean, Europe utilizes 92% of its hydro capacity, okay? Africa, I think it's 4%, right? But European NGOs lobby against it because, they have this somehow idealized view of a river in Africa and human building a dam is just evil and might mess up my whitewater rafting or whatever, let alone ignoring the local development benefits. So they've been against that as well, right? So it's only solar and wind, and we mentioned the challenges around that. What happens when the sun isn't shining or the wind isn't blowing? They're going to burn coal, which is what's happening in China. We've got 200 coal plants under construction. India's going to expand their coal by 60% by the end of the decade. The two of them use 70% of the world's coal, and that's the main reason emissions have been going up since 2019. And I think, actually, Western policies, failure to fund natural gas in particular, to back up renewables, is a big reason why the developing world is burning more coal and emissions are going up. Plus we're having energy price spikes, plus we're having energy shortages. So we're failing on all three legs of the energy trilemma of availability, affordability, and sustainability. And then you have this issue going back and forth between sort of north and south. And that's, I think, a big part of what the UAE has been trying to bridge here at COP28, is actually being inclusive, yes, inclusive with industries and having all industries present, but really having the global south frame the debate up front and be consulted in the whole setting of the discussion here. And I'm hopeful for that.
Okay, Assistant Secretary, you can come in first on this. I know, Aubrey, you also want to jump in, so Assistant Secretary, you first.
Yeah, thanks. I just wanted to shift the tenor a little bit from my friend Majid, and just so we don't get caught up in too much of a chorus of doom, because I think there are some real reasons for hopefulness here. One is what's happening in the United States. Look at our energy economy, where despite the growth of our economy, the growth of our population, the carbon intensity of our economy is declining significantly because our labs are delivering, because our companies are delivering and technology works. And I think the real challenge that we face in the years ahead, and let's be clear, I mean, the world is going to need all the energy that it can find in the decades ahead. And again, my South Asia lens, hundreds of millions of people in South Asia who are coming into the middle class. That is a good thing for humanity. But they all want cars and air conditioners and big color TVs and all the things we take for granted. So we have to figure out how to deliver the energy that is going to satisfy those desires in a less carbon intensive manner than we have become accustomed to. And I think on Majid's point, I mean, it's going to be all of the above. We want to make sure that we reduce as fast as possible the most carbon damaging energy sources. So that means avoiding coal for all that we can, manage. It also means really pushing the envelope in terms of technology deployment. And again, I come back to markets. Government can help, and I think it's terrific. I mean, if you look at our very large Biden administration presence here at COP, the fact that I'm here with Scott from DFC, the CEO of DFC, Rita Jo Lewis from Exim, the director of USTDA, Eno. So we're trying to use those government tools, but it really is a matter of unlocking private capital. But I think I get nervous when I'm in one of these conversations where everybody suggests that we're on a downward spiral, and I think this is another one where I'll lean back on our friend Fatih Birol. I mean, if you look at what the IEA has been able to pull together in terms of the data, the energy transition is happening faster than the models and the markets had assumed. And it's a good thing it is, because the world is screaming out at us to say we need to stay on that pathway and in fact accelerate it.
So no, I'm certainly not doom and gloom. I'm optimistic, and I think the fact of this energy crisis is hopefully waking people up. And full credit to the U.S. government, not only for the presence here and the initiatives, but we've seen it. I mean, you mentioned Scott and DFC. We've had US DFC support for a gas project in Iraq that displaces diesel. And so actually we're avoiding more than 5 million tons a year of CO2 with that project. And that's more than Tesla's, all the Tesla cars at the moment. I think that the challenge that you're seeing is, because in the past other institutions have not been funding gas, for example, now we have in Africa an Africa Energy Bank formed to fund fossil fuels in Africa because they're tired of waiting for other institutions. So I hope that we will start to see common sense, because you can't morally or practically go to somebody without stable baseload power and say, don't do what I do, enjoy stable baseload power, you can have a solar panel and a battery. Well, they try that. It works at best a light switch, a small fridge, a mobile phone charger, not a television or air conditioner or a cooker. So they go back to burning wood and dung and then coal, right? So we fail. So you have to have a solution for firm baseload power, and actually gas backing up renewables is how the US has done it, how the UK has done it, how Israel's done it. If you don't provide those solutions, you will have more burning of coal.
It's especially relevant when the rivers themselves are starting to dry up. When, gas provision, baseload, is really an essential element of adapting to climate change as well.
Aubrey.
No, I'm optimistic in that there are new players on the scene. Particularly, look at the commitments the UAE's made in terms of financing and putting real numbers on the board. And let's see if they get project developed. You know, if it gets the project development gap. But I'm optimistic about those, and I'm optimistic about new technologies as well, and that there are many who are trying to take a more nuanced decision-making approach to investing in things that are green, let's say. So, you know, Jake Levine from DFC, you know, we had conversations where we were talking about the fact that, for example, a supply chain today, it's status quo supply chain. Let's just take how fuel gets to Eastern Congo today. It's put on a ship in the Persian Gulf. It's taken across the ocean to Mombasa. It's offloaded onto trucks. It's driven the distance of New York to California. And then that is a dirty supply chain. It's carbon intensive. There's all kinds of idling of trucks, et cetera. So maybe building a refinery in East Africa is actually cleaner because the fuel won't have to go all that way. But if we take gut reactions to deciding about what is green and what is not, and don't have a kind of nuanced analysis, then we'll miss out on those opportunities, leaving the dirty status quo because we don't want to face the criticism, the opinion of on surface saying, oh, we're doing a refinery and that could be greener than what is today, but everyone would be like, no, a refinery is no way greener. You see, so somehow we need to have both this nuance and some courage in the face of rapid fire, you know, TikTok, Instagram world gut reaction. And that's a very difficult thing to address. So I don't envy you, Assistant Secretary. Like that's very difficult.
Hot take diplomacy.
Yeah, exactly.
Look, this has been such a fascinating discussion, and I just wanted to ask the Assistant Secretary one more question before we wrap it up, sir. For those who don't know, the Kremlin has confirmed in the last few hours that the Russian President Vladimir Putin will be traveling to the UAE and Saudi Arabia as soon as tomorrow and Thursday. You are the former ambassador for Ukraine. Explain to me what you think the president's role and purpose of the visit is, and ultimately, when it comes to the European context here and the conversation around energy, what do you see as Ukraine's future role in the European energy system?
So on Vladimir Putin, I have no idea, because this is a guy who has done more to accelerate energy transition in Europe than any politician in Brussels. But I think, you know, here we are a year and a half into the war and Russia's weaponization of its energy resources. It's clear Russia is never again going to be viewed as a reliable energy supplier. And we have maintained unity, transatlantic unity in our price cap coalition on the principle that we will deny Russia the fossil energy resources that it has used to prosecute this terrible war against the people of Ukraine. So that's that. And then on Ukraine itself, it's been my priority here at COP. I think I've had 4 different events. My 5th will be tonight with the Atlantic Council focused on Ukraine. Deeply, deeply inspiring to see how determined the Ukrainians themselves are to build a cleaner, greener, modern European energy system, even in the face of this war. And I think the messages of support from the United States, and I heard yesterday Commissioner Simpson, today Vice President Šefčovič, it is a very clear message. Ukraine is going to be a member of the European Union. Brussels and the members of the EU and the United States are going to work as hard as we can, both to help Ukraine build the resilience it needs to defeat the brutal attacks on civilian energy infrastructure that the Kremlin is engaged in, including as recently as the weekend before last, but also to help Ukraine build an energy system that is fully aligned with the European Union and Ukraine's eventual EU membership. I will also say, as we look to a post-war period, there's no reason why Ukraine should not be seen as a tremendous investment opportunity and as a country that will be a major energy supplier to the rest of the European Union. It has one of Europe's largest nuclear fleets. It has significant wind and solar resources. It has very strong human capital, and it has demonstrated over the 18 months of this war just extraordinary fortitude and resilience. And I say this as somebody who lived in the European Union as ambassador to Greece for 6 years. The kind of energy and commitment to European principles that the Ukrainians have demonstrated is exactly what the EU needs going forward to be successful and to be the strong partner that the United States needs on this side of the Atlantic Ocean.
Assistant Secretary, I appreciate you taking my question. Aubrey, Daniel, Majid, thank you for your contributions today. And ladies and gentlemen, please, again, make them feel welcome. And of course, stay tuned. We have much more ahead for you with a very special speaker up next.